How's my
Like to
going?
see your recital in the next 6 months. I honestly don't even really understand the process because creativity is so bizarre. Somehow I've been conning my way through that process for the last 20 years. And he would go, I hate this modern music. And I'm like, this thing is literally older than you. And you're like zeroing in on 100.
Brilliant. So, Austin, thank you so much for talking with us. I'm a
My
massive
pleasure.
fan of so many of your soundtracks. And yeah,
Very
just to get
kind.
started with a very broad question, impossible to answer. What makes a good video game soundtrack?
um, um, I actually wouldn't say that it's impossible to answer, but I would say that it's never any one thing. So obviously, individual tastes are gonna vary a lot. But for me, when I'm looking at when I play a game, like obviously I judge my own work completely differently, and generally it's there's never sort of such thing as good enough. um, with regard to my own work. Uh, in other words, it never really feels finished. But when I just go and play a game and I want to kind of take stock of how well I think it's going, um, there's a few criteria. It's sort of one, um, is there something unique about it, like from an aesthetic standpoint? Does it draw on an interesting palette of instruments, or does it use them in an unexpected way? Does it sort of commit to a quality, like a characteristic that, just somehow gives it a novelty. Perfect example, actually, from one of my absolute favorites from this year is Lorien Testard's music from Expedition 33, which is, um, it heavily draws on, you know, piano and guitar plus voice, which is, you know, not exactly revolutionary, but it's so committed to that aesthetic that even though there's actually quite a lot else to it, there's tons of electronics and there's jazz and there's all kinds of other things in there. Um, it really takes on a character by virtue of its steadfast commitment. So that's usually one of the things I look at. It's because every time we're writing a score, sometimes it's 2, 3, 4 hours of music we have to write, and so you're constantly going, well, I guess I already did this. I'll just reach for another tool in my toolbox. And the problem that can happen then is you end up with scores that they're very every piece sounds kind of like it's its own little universe. And for me, what makes for a great one is when every little part is very clearly of a single whole, that it's cohesive on a big picture scale, that 4 hours of music feels like one thing that's just broken up into a bunch of smaller parts, but that it really is coming from a single place. Um, so that's really important to me is that sort of it's another way to describe that would be sort of creative vision. It's the thing I tend to work the hardest on in my own work to just make sure that it seems like it has some kind of something about it that makes it sort of only that thing. Um, but of course, there's also like this is a very just basic thing, but I'm a sucker for memorable melody. That's just one of those gifts that is, not every composer has, and it's something you can work on. I'm always trying to be better in my own writing in that way. But some composers just seem to just very naturally melodies just come out that are just that stick. Again, I'll use Claire Obscura as a great example, but there's many. Gareth Coker, a colleague of mine, has a fantastic gift for melody. Um, I love Darren Korb's sense for melody. There's a bunch. And then of course the third thing I would say is um how the music is integrated into the gameplay is massively important as well. That's the one that's easy to forget because we live in a world where you go appreciate a soundtrack on Spotify, and that has nothing to do with its actual architecture in the game. And that's so important. Does the music actually weave into the gameplay, or is it basically just the equivalent of hitting play on the right track at the right moment? That could be fine, but for me, the true greats have to be very just seamlessly woven in where almost can't really you can't see where the edges are. That's to me, that's the real art of video game music that makes it so distinct from all others. So it's really important. So there you go.
And like all of the stuff that you're saying there, it's just stuff that. So I'm completely musically inept. I don't get how any of it works, but
I can push back against that. I once heard it said perfectly that if your best friend or one of your parents or somebody like that calls you on the phone and you like in the before times where you don't see their name on the screen, you just answer and you know their voice, you recognize it. That's all having a musical ear is. You've just applied it to normal human interactions, but it's a skill that no one is without this skill. It's just so don't be hard on yourself.
okay, I'll try my best.
Good.
But yeah, like
Expect to see your recital in the next 6 months.
yeah, I'll be at the concert. I'll be performing.
Perfect.
Yeah, so I just want to know like how the whole process works. Like, how do you look at a game and know what that sounds like, and where does it begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key word there that I would disentangle is the word "know," because one never really knows. It is a an explorational process where usually I'm very lucky. The majority of the projects that I'm involved with, they bring me in very early, and it tends to be a very open-ended conversation. They don't really know what to do yet with music, and they're kind of looking to me to help find the answer, as opposed to, "Here's what we're looking for. We think you'd be a great fit. Can you just be off and running?" I do have jobs like that, but the majority, especially collaborations with folks like Giant Squid, games like Sword of the Sea and Abzû and Pathless, and prior to that, with that game company on Journey, there's so much of it is just the game doesn't even exist. It's barely even just concept drawings. It's mostly an elevator pitch. And so I wish I could say there's some process or some kind of trick to it. It's literally just, well, what's the first thing that came to mind? I guess I'll try that. I usually think about it a lot. I'm a big fan of having a kind of research R&D phase where you just try to not write anything and just let ideas simmer, and then things start to kind of connect in your subconscious, and you'll invariably be in the car or in the shower or in line at the market or whatever, and then a thought will burst in and get out my phone and send myself a little email going, "Ooh, what if I tried this?" or blah blah blah. But at some point, once I've done enough of that, I just start trying things, and sometimes you get lucky and you just kind of, for whatever reason, land on a thing that everyone feels good about and seems to gel with. And then other times it's, let's try a few things. Sometimes multiple competing ideas will come to mind, and I'll just try them all, and I'll put all of them like a buffet in front of the team and say, "Here's one, here's another." I'm actually working on a project right now where they said, "Let's start with a main theme," which is very often where people want to start, like because it's sort of like the headline of the article or it's the thesis statement of the essay. And so I wrote two themes that I felt each could potentially be a good candidate for the project. And then right as I was getting ready to send it, I was like, I have this other idea kind of kicking around my head that's totally different from those, but for whatever reason, it seems like this could be a good way to go. So on a whim, I quickly whipped up the third one, and the third one was the one that they were like, "Oh, that totally feels like this game." And it was one of those that I almost didn't include it because it seemed superfluous. So sometimes that's how it goes. It's like that game isn't even announced yet. I can't even talk about what that project is, but that's one where, when eventually it comes out, if anyone is curious or they hear it, it would be a funny story of it was almost not this, because I wouldn't have even played it for the team, and they would have been evaluating from several others. So in any case, yeah, I honestly don't even really understand the process because creativity is so bizarre, where you just sort of, it's like if you just think hard enough, something that doesn't exist starts to exist. It doesn't really logically make sense to me how that should work, but somehow I've been conning my way through that process for the last 20 years, so no one's discovered my imposterness yet.
And yeah, like you said, you've been doing this for 20 years now. Did you think, even in that 20 years, like the amount that video game music has evolved and come on, not just as like an art form, but I guess its reputation as well. It's so much more well regarded now. Um, is that something that you have seen from the inside working on it, the way that's changed over the last 20 years?
Yeah, I should say no one in the industry has ever questioned the validity of what we do. In the same way that an artist or an animator working on a video game doesn't look there and say, "Yeah, but Pixar are the real artists, and we're just children playing with toys." Like everyone in the whole industry works hard. It's nice when the reach of games in the culture at large has kind of brought with it some of that cachet and validation. And I was recently invited just as a friend, to Naughty Dog was celebrating their 40th anniversary, and they did this art gallery exhibition here in Los Angeles. And I went thinking it was going to be all art from within Naughty Dog, concept art from all their various projects over the years. But actually, what it mostly was them curating really high quality fan art and putting it in an exhibition as like a proxy, so fan art of all their titles, including even their one they're working on that's not even, it's basically just a trailer is all that's known of it. There's like already fan art for that. Um, and it was so amazing to see because you think, the whole it's like rising tides raises all boats, even just fan art is being treated as gallery worthy art, um, because they work hard on it. They put a lot of effort into it, and they have a lot of skill and talent and good taste, and it leads to results. And so yeah, it's I think seeing like the rise of concerts and the rise of art gallery exhibitions and things like published art books are are all but expected now. So I can't say it's not like a revelation. It's sort of more like from the inside. It's more like, yeah, exactly. We've been screaming this from the rooftop from the beginning. And it's so nice to see that it's catching on and becoming more normal.
And like interestingly, a few months ago, I went to see the Birmingham Symphony Orchestra do a collection of game music because a friend of mine's dad was in the choir, and his mum came along with us, and she is a big fan of classical music. And coming out of it, she was so blown away because I think a lot of people still have this idea of game music as the kind of beeps and boops kind of thing, where obviously it's so much more than that. So uh, what would you say to someone who is interested in classical music and maybe has that kind of preconception about the value of game music?
Well, they need only listen. There's infinite numbers of radio programs and YouTube channels, and there's a lot out there to really show the linkage and the lineage that it's part of. And as with classical music, it's such a deep well that there's already so much that they could go, oh, it turns out I really like this kind of music, and like the kinds of scores that tend to show up in these kinds of games, but I'm less excited about this other kind. In the same way that there are classical music lovers that would never want to go to a chamber concert to hear string quartets from the second Viennese school composers of the 1940s and 50s. You know what I mean? Like, or there's people. I mean, I remember when I was in school, I would spend time. I had an elderly cousin who I used to spend my Friday night dinners with. He was technically my grandfather's cousin, so he was about 90 years old, and so in other words, he was born, in what, like the 1920s, and he would hear a piece come on. Like the classic example was always the Rite of Spring, which is from the teens, 19 teens. What was it, 1914? I think it premiered. Um, and he would go, "Ah, I hate this modern music. I only, he wanted to only listen to Brahms and Beethoven and Mendelssohn." And I'm like, this thing is literally older than you, and you're like zeroing in on 100. And it's older than you by admittedly only a few years, but the idea of scoffing at that as modern is hilarious. And But there are people like that in the video game world as well, where they go, "Oh, I don't love like I love very pure instrumental music." So like the JRPG aesthetic, which so often incorporates jazz and funk and all kinds of other stuff, even when it's orchestral, they may bounce off of that. But then I know plenty of folks that that's all they love. Anything that feels too classical or even too Hollywood, they go, that's really not my thing. I really love this kind of the fusion that you get from the sort of, typically more sort of Eastern take on all this, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, I'm skimming the surface, but anyone who's ever interested in this stuff, I always say, well, look, if it's an actual conversation with someone, I just try to say, well, what do you like? What are you into? And I can probably name 10 scores that are a good gateway drug for you, just specific to your taste.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because, like, on the flip side, you have so many gamers that listen to these soundtracks in their spare time. They love Baldur's Gate and Elden Ring and Zelda and all of these things that have such great scores. But if you ask them if they were interested in classical music, they would just say they weren't, when clearly there's evidence to the that they do. So, yeah, I was thinking, like, with regards to some of the big orchestral scores that have come out in the past few years, are there any composers or pieces that you would recommend as someone who is maybe interested in checking out some classical music to get into?
Meaning, what would be my classical recommendations?
Yeah.
Or do you mean, yeah, I mean, it's one of those where it is very hard to do this broadly, but obviously there are the staples. There are the ones that have exerted influence over every composer, whether they like it or not. I already mentioned like The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky, his other ballets, The Firebird and Petrushka, um, are absolute light landmarks of orchestral writing. And every composer has a relationship. They either actively reject it or they're influenced by it, but there's no neutrality. And similar one would be Gustav Holst's The Planets. This is another one of those pieces that just casts an incredibly long shadow. There's quite a lot of contemporary, 20th century composers that I think have been very meaningfully impactful on composers in general, video game music in particular. You've got people like Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland. From the British school, you've got composers like Ralph Vaughan Williams, for example. One of my favorite video game scores of all time is Jessica Curry's Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, which is deeply indebted to the sensibilities of composer Ralph Vaughan Williams, a very like, British composer drawing on British folk music in a truly extraordinary, beautiful way. And then there's the sort of more modern, more recent uh, descendants in a way of his tradition in the form of composers like, William Walton or Benjamin Britten, who took the Britishness and kind of stretched it to a, a far reach. And then obviously there's a reason why things like Beethoven and Mozart have really stood the test of time. I personally am a huge fan of Felix Mendelssohn, who was kind of early mid 19th century. The story of the 19th century is one of this kind of arms race where the music just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because you're coming into the 19th century with, like a composer like Mozart, who had been dead for only a few years at the dawn of the year like 1800. And you've got Beethoven, who's very much kind of in the middle of his great stride, and he starts expanding the dimensions of everything. And Beethoven is generally considered the figure in which the Romantic era was born. And from that point forward, it just becomes this escalation, from him to, Schumann and Brahms, and eventually, Mahler and Strauss and Wagner and Verdi and all these composers that are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, culminating in really Wagner above all. And and Mendelssohn, who's in the middle of all that, never really seemed to buy into that. And his music, I always say his music moves the way Legolas moves, where he's kind of like a cat, just always on his toes and doesn't ever seem to have momentum or loss of control. And it was very inspirational composer when I was working on Assassin's Creed Syndicate. The idea was have something that feels very darting and flighty and doesn't feel like a giant lumbering juggernaut, but actually kind of moves with this precision like a fencer or something, as opposed to this giant swordsman. And so yeah, there's so much. One of the coolest concerts I ever got to do was years ago, more than 10 years ago. An orchestra here in Los Angeles invited myself and two other composers to put our game music on stage and pair it with a classical piece that inspires us. So the concert was basically 50-50 video game music, but not just random classical music. It was classical music that has some kind of kinship with the video game music as a way to kind of, you know, broaden, like to bring in both crowds. It was one of the coolest shows ever. And we all spoke on stage to explain why we chose the music we did. And it was awesome.
So what did you choose?
I chose were performing music of Journey. This was not long after Journey had come out. And I chose a piece that's called the 4C Interludes, which is a concert extraction from these little interludes that were used in an opera called Peter Grimes by a composer named Benjamin Britten. And in the context of the opera, they're mostly there to have the orchestra do stuff while the scene is changed behind the curtain. Um, but they're such spectacular pieces that they became popular to just perform on their own, completely separate from the opera and all the singers and stuff. So it's actually probably much more popular than the actual opera. And, but yeah, to me, that piece, it's Journey is not sort of directly inspired by that, but that piece is generally in my blood, I would say.
Okay, awesome. Like Journey is my favorite one of your soundtracks, so good to know. I'll be keeping that in mind.
No, that's very kind. Yeah, yeah. Go look up the 4C, like SEA, like ocean, 4C interludes. It's just beautiful, imaginative, very colorful music.
And like we are here talking because you are conducting the BAFTA Games and Music concert next year.
That's
Are
right.
you able to share any sneak peeks of what is going to be there?
Well, we've already made some announcements. We've got the goal is to have a real nice variety of music because that is itself the most honest representation of what BAFTAs as an institution have enshrined over the last 20 years. One of the things that is very positive about BAFTAs as an entity is because these awards are hashed out by a jury, which I've been on in the past, and it's definitely a discussion where people really can get into it and really advocate for their scores, and it's very much almost like a jury trial, where everyone's really kind of got opinions and they're working through it, and it's really great because it really means that there's a process to try to ensure that the nominees are not just chosen on a whim or trend chasing, flavor of the month kind of things like that. Um, and also because of that, you'll have a composer doing their first ever game, like Christopher Madigan on Cuphead, um, which is on our program. Um, and composers who've been in the business for a long time and really made a big impact. Um, like Jesper Kyd, on the Hitman and Assassin's Creed franchises, both. Um, and So yeah, I'll just say it's a really nice lineup. It's one of those where, um, when they approached me to be involved in the concert, I said my priority is that while of course, um, I want it to feel reflective of the history of the BAFTAs, and obviously I'm honored to. I've got a couple of them on my shelf. I'm very um I feel very lucky to have been treated very nicely by the BAFTAs. But I want it to feel like it's really that's just a proxy for the art. And the reason why I was happy to do it in no small part is because I think the BAFTAs actually are themselves a pretty representative proxy of the art. Nothing's ever perfect. There are invariably great scores and great composers that never won anything or seemingly got noticed by anybody. That's inevitable, especially when there's just so much every year and you can't nominate 30 scores. Um, but I feel like it's a pretty good pool. And I said, I really want to make sure that we're not just choosing, kind of obvious AAA franchises or something, but also nor are we turning our back on them as though, oh, it's just mainstream triple. And like, there's really great work at every sector. And so I feel like we've managed to be pretty faithful to that mission. It's an ongoing project. Obviously, we're still working on details of it. But it's great. I mean, I'm really excited about it.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to go and see it as well. But yeah, Austin, thanks so much for chatting with us. We really appreciate it.
No, it's absolutely my pleasure. Sorry to have to be kind of succinct, but it is
No
absolutely my
problem.
pleasure.